Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to many of you out there. I am excited to have you joining us at today's Unemployment Risk Management webinar for specifically for YMCAs. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be available via email after the session. We will also have the PowerPoint presentation and the Shroom and HRCI credits emailed to everyone at the conclusion. They'll be coming from my colleague Janessa, so don't be concerned if you see it's a safe email. It's coming from Janessa Ponko here at 501c Services. Um, and the video microphone, the video, audio, and chat are all disabled for the audience. So if you do have questions, you can use the Q&A box found on your toolbar there. If not, check your More box for the Q&A. We will be attempting to answer these questions throughout the webinar. We are pretty tight for time. This is only 60 minutes today. So if we do not have time to address them today, those questions are recorded. And when we do our follow-up, we will be sure to answer your questions then. And I also just want to let you know that closed captioning is available, but must be turned on by you. If it is not on your control bar, click the More button. So with no further ado, I think we're ready to get rolling. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Heidi Posada, and I have been with 501c Services for a little over 15 years, working to help nonprofits understand their different opportunities when it comes to managing unemployment. Prior to coming to 501, I worked for American Cancer Society for 5 years, and before that, I was with the YMCA. So I was just talking to one of our presenters, Greg, talking about my time at the 150th year anniversary, and I'm looking forward to celebrating 175 in a few weeks with you all at General Assembly. And we will be doing introductions to Nicole and Greg when they come up for their speaking parts. So just a quick review. Today we will be talking about a brief history of unemployment, the different options you have as a nonprofit when it comes to managing unemployment. And then Nicole will be speaking more in depth about chargeability and liability and types of separations and adjudication strategies. So first, we are the host of today's webinar. We are 501c Services, and we have been a trusted partner with the Y for more than 40 years. We started back in 1982, and ever since our beginning, we have worked with the YMCA. And we started with about 25 nonprofits. We've now expanded to working with over 3,000 nonprofits nationwide, and that includes nearly 150 Ys. So how do we help nonprofits? Well, we help the majority of our nonprofit clients are reimbursing, and we help them primarily manage unemployment through claims management, HR services, outplacement services, stop loss protection, and savings. So really our services are geared towards nonprofits who have elected to opt out of the state unemployment system and reimburse for their claims. And all of these services are attempted to take a holistic approach to managing your unemployment. So a little bit about our Y clients. We're so excited to have so many of you joining us today. Everybody here today, I believe, is not using our services. So hopefully, if you're not, maybe you'll know one of these Ys that is currently using us. Again, we go back over 40 years working with the Y. Here's kind of a snapshot of where our members are. Shout out to Pennsylvania. We've got quite a few of you there, and New Jersey, and but all over the country we are working with Ys. And again, here's just another snapshot, some specific Ys that are using our services. We're actually going to be at the Tampa YMCA next week doing a presentation. So excited to see them. So Greg, I think I'm going to hand off to you and let you introduce yourself and your experience working with 501 before I jump into reimbursing.
Great. Well, thank you, Heidi. Good to see all of my YMCA colleagues. So I'm Greg Weibel. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at YUSA. I serve on the board of 501c services as a trustee. And I'm representing YUSA as well as the greater Y network. So my role on the board is to make sure that the trust is being run well, that it's delivering real value to nonprofit members, including our 150 YMCAs, and that it stays aligned with the mission of organizations like ours at the Y. So I joined the board because I believe in what 501c3 does. They take the real cost burden off nonprofits and let us, as YMCA professionals, focus our resources on programs and not necessarily tax liabilities. So, as COO at YUSA, I work alongside local Ys every single day. I understand the financial pressures our organizations operate under, our tight margins, our donor accountability, and a workforce that's, of course, heavily seasonal and part-time. I spent my career in most of my career in the Y movement. I'm going to be celebrating 21 years. Before this role at YUSA, I led the YMCA of Honolulu, as well as I was in Minneapolis for about 15 years as well. So I understand both the national picture and what it's like to run a Y at the local level. So unemployment costs are not always top of mind for Y leadership. We have plenty of things to think about and do, but they should be. It should be something that we're paying some attention to and considering. So they're recurring, they can be substantial, but there is some level of control that we can have over them. And we're going to talk more about that. So at YUSA, we've had a long-standing collaboration with 501c3 services, goes back over 40 years as a preferred vendor for our unemployment cost management. And we've been doing that since 2010. So it's not just a casual endorsement. We know that 501c does get results, and that's validated across 150 Ys across the movement. So our Ys have chosen to step out of that state tax pool, and we'll be getting into details here, and take direct control of their unemployment costs. So the unemployment management practices that the trust encourages do help to reduce your overall risk of employing people. Proper management can also reduce the cost of employing people when they separate from us. And 501c3 team members today are going to demonstrate how that works. So back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. And I didn't know the Minnesota connection we have. I'm from Minnesota, so learn new things every day. So yeah, so I will talk about I've already mentioned the reimbursing option, and I'm going to just review the different methods you have to fund reimburse or fund your unemployment. First though, I always like to start at the beginning. So up in unemployment started in 1935 as part of the New Deal and all of the social services that were coming to help people during the Great Depression. At the time, nonprofits were not putting into the unemployment program. They weren't paying for it, but employees from nonprofits didn't benefit from the same benefits that everybody in the for-profit world benefited from. Fast forward to 1972. Congress passed the Social Security Act, and they now were mandating that nonprofits participate in unemployment, giving all of your employees that safety net that everybody else was receiving. With a caveat, they decided to give you two options. So everybody else up until now was a merit-rated employer. But when this act was passed in 1972, they gave the option of either being tax rated or reimbursing. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what both of these options mean. First, tax rated, it means that you are paying usually on a quarterly basis, sometimes monthly. The state picks the wage base. It ranges anywhere from $7,000 in the state all the way up to, I think, nearly $50,000, maybe even $60,000. So taxable wages vary greatly. States can change these taxable wages. They've been changing them quite a bit. I think we've got someone here from Colorado. I know they've just changed, increased taxable wages by over 100% over the last 5 years. So the state really can control a lot. No matter how much you're controlling your expenses, the state can control a lot of how much you're paying into the state pool. The tax rate is a pool, so you are paying usually around $2 you're paying into the pool for every dollar you get out. That's just an average. It's not apply to everyone, but that is the average that most nonprofits are paying about $2 for every dollar they get out. There are definitely benefits for some organizations to choose to be merit rated. If you're a smaller organization, sometimes your tax rate, even if you have a really high taxable wage, sometimes your tax rate is so low that it's worth paying that insurance to cover the cost of one unemployment claim. If you have a lot of volatility, we know sometimes, I hate to say specific programs because I don't want people to rule themselves out, but sometimes with a program like Head Start, you might experience a lot of ongoing claims, which which may make paying the taxes a better option. Basically, if you're a YMCA that has a tremendous number of claims compared to what you're paying in SUI, and then of course some states we just find have lower tax rates, have lower tax burden, and so sometimes in those states, paying the state unemployment taxes into the SUI makes more sense. Now to talk about reimbursing, this is what all 150 Ys that are using our services, plus many more, have elected to reimburse. And what that means is you change with the state, and if this is the direction you want to go, we do help you with that. Rather than paying based on your tax rate and taxable wage base, your tax rate basically becomes zero, and the state sends you an invoice based on exactly what your claims have been. So if you've been paying $2 for every dollar in claims, you're now only going to pay that $1 in claims. So there's no pooled contribution. A lot of times when they have extra charges through the state to replenish the pools, you're not burdened by those as a reimbursing employer. For the former employees, there's no difference. I sometimes talk to leadership or nonprofit leaders, and they say, well, we don't want to take on extra work. It's no extra work for you. The state is still determining the weekly benefit amount. The state is still paying the former employees. You still have the right to protest claims. The only difference is how the state is charging you for unemployment. So general benefits, a lot of times people save. I just did an analysis for a nonprofit in Colorado, and we saw over $100,000 on average savings. Now that's not the norm. It depends on how much you're paying in unemployment, but it really can reduce your overall cost. What we see typically is about a 30 to 40% savings compared to paying in the tax pool. If you use a service like 501c services, it's much more predictable budgeting. We have you pay a deposit into your reserve account to help you manage the highs and lows of unemployment. And because you're only paying for the claims, it should make your budget more predictable. And again, really being better stewards of donor dollars. You're not overpaying into a state pool that you have many times no control over. So, Greg, I'm going to hand this back over to you. If you can talk about a case study we recently did for one of our YMCAs. Those of you that might know Alan Lesher, the former CEO here, he was also on the board like Greg is, and we did this. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Greg, and let you talk about it a little more in depth.
Sure. Thank you, Heidi. So the YMCA of Inland Northwest is just a great example of what the trust membership looks like in practice over time. So this Y is in Spokane, Washington, with a large seasonal workforce and all the unemployment exposure that comes with it, like probably all of the Ys on this call. So they have been a 501c agency's trust member since 2006. So we have 20 years of data that we can point to, and we did this case study. So over that period, they have saved more than $600,000 in state unemployment tax liability and have earned more than $147,000 in investment income. And you'll say, what? I don't understand how this works. We'll get into that more. With the gross annual average savings about $35,000 a year. Hey, that's pretty substantial. So YMCA's we have a workforce profile that makes unemployment costs especially significant. We run all of our youth serving programs, membership with lots of seasonality, as well as lots of part-time work. And so that's high turnover by design. And under the state tax model, you pay for it even when your claims are low. So under the reimbursing model, again, you only pay for your actual claims. So if your workforce management is strong, so you have some good documentation, you have fair processes, you have strong HR practices, your costs do go down. The Inland Northwest Y proved that for the last 2 decades. So this is money that stays with our YMCA, fuels our mission, and saves paying into the state plan. So when I was leading the YMCA of Honolulu, managing operational costs, we looked at unemployment, and we had to be deliberate about it. And so we were able to find this predictability. I always felt like it was fair because we're paying for truly the costs that we should be based on our experiences. And that to me seems fair. And so that's the real value for a Y leader to be part of this program. I'll hand it back over to you.
Hey guys, 1 second. I'm gonna try to get Heidi back online here. Give me 30 seconds.
Maybe until Heidi gets here. One of the things that will happen if you're interested in the services
Oh, you're
is
fine. You're
part
good.
of
Just
what will
gotta
happen is 501c will help you with the analytics to say, is this a good opportunity? Is it not a good opportunity? And if you see that it is, then they help you work through how to get on board, how to do this, et cetera. So this is a great program where 501c is your partner along the way and can help you both with the analytics as well as getting you on board.
Are
Okay,
we on the
great.
right slide, Nicole?
I believe so. Yep, yep.
Okay, sorry
I,
about that. Yeah, Mike, I was listening to Greg and all of a sudden my computer just went dark. So we're back. Yeah, I'll go ahead and hand over to Nicole, who I'll do a quick introduction to Nicole, who I have had the pleasure of working with for about 5 years here at 501c. Before she came here, she worked in the unemployment industry, I think, for about 15 years. And we're just very excited to have her expertise helping our members here.
All right, Heidi, can you go ahead and flip to the next slide?
Yes.
Okay, so Heidi's gone through the different options that you have for financing your unemployment. But regardless of which way you choose to finance the unemployment, the reality is unemployment directly impacts your bottom line, right? One of the most common things we hear people say is, "Oh, I paid into unemployment. You know, it's a benefit that I've earned," and that's actually not the case at all. It is 100% financed by employers, and it is somewhat controllable, right? There are best practices and things that we can do to manage those costs. And so that's what we're really going to get into today. If you're looking at this slide, you'll see here that the amount that someone can collect at unemployment varies greatly by state, right? So you've got anything from $275 a week in the state of Florida up to $1,208 a week potentially in a state like Washington. So, you know, if an unemployment claim can go up to 26 weeks, you do the math. It can be a very expensive cost for your organization. And so what we want to do today is we're going to go we don't have a lot of time, but we're going to try to do like a 30,000 foot overview of some best practices of how you can manage your claims and understand what the state's looking for when adjudicating. So first things first, in order to be eligible for someone to collect unemployment, they have to be, I need you to click through the slide. There we go. You need to be physically able to perform some kind of work. Okay. You have to be available to work. So can't be going to college full time. You can't be on vacation in Europe and drawing unemployment benefits. You have to be available. You also have to be actively seeking work, which is why if you've ever collected unemployment benefits, you know that you have to report on a regular basis all the jobs that you've been applying for and seeking. You have to meet the state's monetary requirements, and this just means you had to have worked long enough to meet the minimum thresholds to be eligible. And then last but not least, you have to be unemployed through no fault of your own, which this is the part that's highly subjective. And so we're going to talk through what exactly that means. So real quick though, the expectations for unemployment have changed a bit, and I do want to cover this because if you've been around for a while, you might be used to the old school of thought. So back in the day, employers often thought that responding to an unemployment claim was a choice, and they would only respond if it was their intent to protest the claim or to contest benefits. But President Obama actually passed the Unemployment Assistance Extension Act of 2011. It went into effect in 2014. And basically the idea was to get more integrity into the unemployment system. And so they're requiring now that employers respond to all unemployment claims with sufficient information and in a timely manner. And this is so they can apply the situation, whatever the separation reason was, to the applicable laws, and they can make a good decision up front versus the employer not providing all the information and then deciding to appeal it to a hearing. And now this individual's collect hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars, and it gets overturned and they've got to go get that money back, right, from an unemployed individual. So the idea behind these new rules really is beneficial for everyone. And it does mandate that employers are required to respond to unemployment claims to avoid potential fines and penalties. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about chargeability and liability. Another really common question we get is, why am I being charged for this claim? Or this person left a year ago and I don't understand why we're getting this claim. They went to work somewhere else. So let me explain the very first thing that the state does when someone files an unemployment claim is they establish something called the base period. And in the majority of all states, the base period is going to be the first 4 of the last 5 completed quarters. So if you look at this graphic here where the arrows are pointing to the white unshaded boxes there to the right, we'll call that the filing quarter. So that would be the quarter the person opens or initiates their claim in. So right now, we are in the month of August. And so if you were to look at that third box down there on the right where it says August, and you look to the left of that, the shaded gray box is what your base period would be. And so you can see that that goes all the way back to April of 2025. So if someone files a claim right now in August of 2026, the state's going to be looking at April of 2025 through March of 2026. And so what is the point of the base period? So the base period is going to tell the state, has the claimant met the minimum wage requirement? So they're going to be looking at all the reportable wages during that period. It's going to tell the state how much the claimant is eligible to collect and for how long. It's going to tell them which employers will receive a claim and what type they'll receive. And it's going to tell them if the claimant is found eligible for benefits, how much is each employer going to pay? So let's walk through an example. Next slide. Perfect. Okay, so this is another graphic kind of showing the filing quarter with that base period being the first 4 of the last 5 completed quarters. And when we look at this, you can see there are 3 employers potentially involved in this claim, right? We've got company A, and they're going to be the last employer, the most recent separating employer. But you can see that their employment period also extends back into that base period. So they're going to be a last employer and a base period employer, which means they're going to receive two different types of claims. Company B and Company C are just base period employers. So they reported wages for this person during that base period, but they're not the employer that's determining this individual's eligibility. Okay, so eligibility for benefits is going to be based on the most recent separation from the most recent employer, and then any employer that has wages reported in the base period could have financial liability for the claim. So in this example, let's say the total reported wages during the base period was $50,000. This is how much the person earned from that April to March timeframe we discussed. And let's say Company A was responsible for 10% of those wages. So even though Company A is the one that let them go and might be the company that's responsible for them getting unemployment, they're only going to be responsible for 10% of the benefits because they only had 10% of the wages in that base period. Company B was responsible for 40% or $20,000 of the $50,000. And so they're going to be responsible for 40% of the benefits. And Company C was responsible for 50%. So even though they're the oldest employer and it goes back nearly 18 months, they're going to be responsible if this person's found eligible from their most recent employer, they're going to be responsible for 50% of the benefits. So in this example, if they earn 50,000, their weekly benefit amount might be somewhere right around $480 a week. And so you can see the breakdown there of what each employer would pay of the weekly benefits. Now, this is how 26, I believe, of the states, I lied, 36. This is how 36 of the states determine chargeability and liability. There are some other states that do it differently. The other two main ways that states do it is some states will charge the last employer, if they've worked for them at least 30 days, will charge them 100% of the claim as long as they also had wages in the base period. If they were the last 30-day employer but didn't have wages in the base period, then they might only have to pay 50%, and the state covers the rest. And the other most common one would be inverse chronological order. So in that one, the liability is actually determined the same exact way as it is in this example. The only difference is they start charging the most recent employer first, and then once they've hit their maximum liability, it would move to employer B if that person's still unemployed, and then employer B would be paying. And then once employer B hits their maximum liability, if the person is still unemployed, then it would move to employer C. So those are the three primary ways that states are going to determine your liability and who gets charged.
Hi,
Next
Nicole.
slide.
We just have a quick comment from Patty who said, we have staff who work for us currently, but are also paying unemployment because they lost their other job. Just doesn't seem right.
Okay, so my guess is that if they're working for you currently, if I understood you correctly, if they're working for you currently, but they lost a primary job and now they're collecting unemployment, it sounds like they're probably a part-time employee for you. And unfortunately, that is one of the stipulations of individuals who work part-time, and their hours vary and they fluctuate. If you're in that base period and you're a potentially chargeable employer, that person's going to have to be reporting all the wages you're currently paying them, and the state will offset the benefits that they collect, but they're still going to do the charging the same way because this individual is actively seeking work and they're not restricting their hours, but there is not enough work available and their wages are falling below that period. So the only way to prevent that is to offer them more hours, and hopefully they'll work enough that they won't be able to collect a partial benefit. Or if you offer them more hours and they decline, you can report that because as I mentioned earlier, you have to be available for work and you have to be actively seeking work. So if you offer them more hours and they say that they're unavailable to take those hours or they decline those hours, you can report that to the state, question their availability for work, and that would be another strategy. And I actually will talk more about part-time employment later on in the presentation. Good question. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about the different types of separations. And I really want to stress that unemployment is not black and white, and it is very gray. It really comes down to the details, and every detail matters. And so what I want to do is I just want to kind of walk through how this works. I want to walk through some, situations and kind of explain what the state is looking for, how they make their adjudication decisions. And this will help you better present your cases so that you can hopefully win the ones that you can. You can't win every case. Not every case is winnable, but there are ones that you can. And you want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to control those outcomes. So first and foremost, the state is going to lump every single separation into one of these three separation types. So like the first one on the list is a discharge, right? This person, we all know that if someone was fired for a violation of policy or gross misconduct, that would be considered a discharge. But what you might not realize is that if you suspend someone, or maybe you do the whole, this isn't really working out, we'll let you quit instead of being fired, quit in lieu of discharge, right? Those are actually going to be adjudicated as a discharge. Even though you didn't technically fire the person, it falls into the discharge category. Then we've got voluntary quits. Obviously, if someone quits, that's a voluntary quit. But what you may not realize is leave of absences are going to be considered a voluntary quit. Even though the person hasn't actually quit the organization, that person is separating themselves from work, and so it is going to be adjudicated as a voluntary quit. And then that third bucket is going to be lack of work. So obviously, if you eliminate positions, do layoffs, staff reductions, that's all lack of work. But again, you may not realize that things like seasonal work, temporary contract assignments, as needed employees, part-time hours that fluctuate up and down, those can all be lumped into a lack of work category. What it really comes down to is to decide which of these three it falls into is the state's going to be looking at things like who was the moving party that initiated separation, was continuing work available, things of that nature. So let's walk through these three and we'll talk about some different strategies here. So the first one we're going to talk about is a discharge. And when it comes down to a discharge, the burden of proof is going to be on the employer because the employer was the moving party that initiated that separation. And in order to get relief from benefits, you're going to have to show that the employee was discharged for misconduct. Okay. And the state generally defines misconduct as a deliberate and willful disregard of an employer's interests or repeated violations of a known company policy. Understand that it is very possible for someone to be discharged for cause. Okay, perfectly good business decision to separate somebody, and it still might not meet the state's definition of misconduct. So what I want to do is I want to actually walk through some of the discharges that are generally not going to fall into that misconduct category. So let's give you some insight into what they're looking for. Back to the previous slide. There we go. So the first one is going to be, well, the first two are very similar. Okay, we've got isolated incidents and we've got good faith errors. And in both of these scenarios, this person, may have violated a policy on the final incident, but they didn't have any previous warnings for a similar infraction. And so what oftentimes you'll find is that the state will either call it an isolated incident of poor judgment or a good faith error. So let me give you just a couple quick examples. We don't have a ton of time, but something, like poor judgment. Let's say you have a camp counselor, John, and he's had a little bit of attendance problems. Maybe he's been late a few times. He's had some warnings for being absent. Maybe he had a warning about his camp uniform. He dressed properly one day for work. And maybe you have a progressive discipline policy that says, well, once you have so many warnings, you have to be terminated, right? And that's pretty common. Verbal, written, final, and then a fourth infraction usually is going to result in a discharge. And maybe on that final incident, maybe grandma comes to pick up a kid from camp, and grandma's not on the approved pickup list. And grandma says, oh, mom's stuck at work. It's an emergency. She asked if I could come. And John he can't find his camp director is otherwise handling another issue, is not available. And John's like, oh, I know grandma. She goes to my church, and I'm pretty sure I've seen her come pick up the kids before. And in that moment, makes the mistake of allowing the child to leave against policy with grandma, even though grandma's not on the list, right? In that scenario, it wouldn't be considered gross misconduct. That would be things like theft, violence, things of that nature, right? It would be considered poor judgment. And since John had never had a warning for something similar in the past, the state might say, well, poor judgment doesn't always equal misconduct. He would have had to have had at least one prior warning showing that he knew that this type of incident would result in termination, right? Another one that's on the list is attendance. Okay, so attendance is a very frustrating topic because obviously we really need our employees to show up in order to be able to run an organization. And unfortunately, attendance often, it's going to come down to the final incident, the final absence that resulted in their termination and whether or not it was beyond the employee's control. So if this individual has maybe exceeded the attendance allowance, but that final incident is they were sick, they properly reported it, they called in and reported it to their manager per the policy. A lot of times the state is going to rule that someone cannot control when they're sick. Someone cannot control when their child is sick and they can't go to daycare. Things like that, a lot of times. Now, not every state looks at it the same way. But it is very, very important with attendance to be documenting the reasons that people give for why they're not coming to work. It really comes down to whether attendance is within someone's control or not within their control, right? So if you've got somebody who's frequently tardy and they're oversleeping, that's within their control, right? Versus someone who's sick or their child is sick and they can't come to work. So it is really, really important to document that. I would say with attendance, because it is very gray, you want to make sure that you're providing all of the necessary information to adjudicate that claim, the reason for the absence, the policies, all of that. And then at the end of the day, if the state says, yeah, we get it, you had a good reason to terminate them, but it's just not misconduct, usually at that point, it's probably best to let it go, as you're not going to change their definition. You're not going to make an illness misconduct by appealing that. And then the last one, which is poor performance. This one is it can be a little controversial at times. But really what it comes down to for unsatisfactory work performance is we have to look at it as wouldn't or couldn't, right? Somebody is able to do the job, but they're not doing it. Or someone that you hired has never been able to perform to your standards since the day that you hired them, right? So well, let's look at an example of a situation, one being not misconduct and the other one being misconduct, right? So let's say you hire Kim and she's going to teach a beginner fitness class, maybe Zumba, and she's super enthusiastic and she's friendly and she really wants to succeed. But despite training and practice, she's constantly losing track of the routines. She's like, everybody go left, and she's going right. Sometimes she gets confused and she's like, where were we? Or what was the next step? And maybe you've provided lots of coaching and additional opportunities for practice, but Kim she just can't lead the class effectively, right? But then you've got Jenny, who's been teaching this fitness class for 4 years. She's always been excellent. And then one day Jenny decides, well, I think following the YMCA's approved class format is just too restrictive. She starts skipping required warm-ups. Maybe she's ignoring safety instructions. She's skipping cool downs and ending the class early. And when asked why, she says, oh, everybody looked tired. I really thought they were ready to go. And Jenny's been coached and warned, but she continues to disregard the expectations and safety requirements, right? So what's the difference here, right? Kim is trying to teach the class, but Kim's got 2 left feet, right? Not her fault. Just not the right you didn't make the right hiring decision to bring him in as a fitness instructor. Whereas Jenny can absolutely teach the class, but maybe she's decided that the YMCA rules are merely inspirational and she doesn't need to follow those, right? And what I would say in that instance, right, we don't want to use the term unsatisfactory work performance because this is sort of a pitfall or a trap that employers kind of fall into is we tend to use this as a like when it doesn't fit any of our other codes, we call it unsatisfactory work performance. It's sort of a catch-all when we don't have a specific violation or something to list. And what I'll say is that's fine. Like maybe your HRIS system has limited code options, and so unsatisfactory performance was the best option in that case. But if it's a situation like Jenny, where Jenny has the ability to do this, she's done it for years, and now she's not performing. Well, like in that example, you really should focus on the policies that she's violating. Don't call it unsatisfactory work performance. She's violating safety protocol. She's, skipping warm-ups that are important for physical health and physical safety, things of that nature. So you really want to focus on the misconduct there, right? The policy that is purposefully being violated versus just calling it unsatisfactory work performance. Because I can tell you, as soon as you say unsatisfactory work performance, the state, they stop listening and they start writing checks. So the key terms that you use when you're presenting an unemployment case are super important. And it's really, and it's okay if your system is coded as unsatisfactory work performance, but this is why documentation is so important. We got to have all the details so that when you get the unemployment claim, you get to paint the picture appropriately. It's okay if what you tell the state doesn't match the code that you used in the system as long as the details are accurate. All right, next slide. So let's talk about documentation. So everything with unemployment starts with documentation because once that person has been terminated, it's too late to go back and get all that proper documentation. So it really starts with effective documentation on the front end. And so it is important to be documenting coachings and warnings. And even verbal warnings are valid, but just make sure that you make a note that that conversation was had in that personnel file. And when it comes time for the unemployment claim, what you're going to have to provide to be compliant with the laws and to be considered to be providing sufficient information for the state to adjudicate the claim is you're going to need to be able to first provide details of the final incident. So what did that person do? What was the last straw that made us decide we're going to terminate them? Then you're going to need to provide a copy of the policy that was violated on that final incident. You're going to need to show that the employee was aware of the policies or should have been aware. So signed handbook acknowledgement, or maybe they did like an online quiz when they got hired. Anything that you can show that the employee was given the policies and that they should have been aware of what those policies are. And then you're going to want to provide any prior corrective action or warnings. So basically it's final incident and you want to really narrow in on that final incident. Don't give a detailed account of everything this person did since day one. It needs to be just the final incident, the policy that they violated on the final incident, the employee's acknowledgement of company policies. Then when we get to prior corrective action and warnings, this is where we get to then show the history of what has led up to this point. And so that is why it's very important to have all of those corrective actions and warnings in the file. Now, witness statements are listed here, but I would caution you on witness statements. It depends on who wrote them. What it's important to know is that everything that you send to the state for an unemployment claim, the claimant will have access to see. They have a right to see the documents that are submitted. So if you're worried about retaliation in any sense or form, I would avoid witness statements, honestly. Manager or supervisor witness statements are good. But if it's a coworker or someone that could cause the former employee to become upset or maybe retaliate, I think it's best to just leave the witness statements out. All right, so voluntary quits are a lot easier when it comes to unemployment claims because the burden of proof is going to be on the former employee. So they're going to have to prove that they quit with good cause attributable to the employer. And what would be considered good cause? So a change in the condition of their employment, compelling reasons such as maybe unaddressed harassment or a hostile work environment. I can tell you that the key with harassment or hostile work environment, they can't just quit and claim that they were being harassed. They would have to show that they brought it to your attention and that you did nothing to address it, right? So the burden of proof is going to be on that former employee, and they're going to have to show that they had good cause. So if you change the condition of employment, if you substantially change their pay or their hours or their job duties, that could be considered a compelling reason. If someone brings an issue to you of harassment or hostile work environment and you do nothing, then that could be considered a compelling reason. Now, you don't always have to address these things to someone's satisfaction, but if you can show that you took the appropriate steps, that the employee was safe, and that you made a reasonable accommodation, again, and the employee still chooses to quit, more times than not, you'll still be successful in getting a disqualification because you fully addressed the situation. There are some states that do have some statutory quits that will allow unemployment. They do vary a little bit by state, but in general, if someone has a dangerous home situation, maybe a domestic violence situation, and they have to leave the area, and maybe they've asked for a job transfer, maybe they've asked for remote work, but in this line of work, it's just not available. As long as they're meeting all the other requirements, a lot of times in that scenario, they're going to be allowed benefits. If somebody has a military spouse that has to move, you have to move locations. Again, as long as they've taken all reasonable measures to try to preserve their job before quitting to move with the spouse. A lot of times they're not going to separate a husband and wife and the husband serving his country. And so a lot of times, as long as they're looking for work in their new place and they're still actively seeking work, oftentimes that would be a statutory situation where someone might be able to collect in a situation where they did voluntarily quit. The other thing is, and I already kind of mentioned this, but continued employment must be available. Okay, so doing the whole, we're going to let you quit instead of getting fired thing is fine for their HR or personnel record. But when it comes time for the unemployment claim, that isn't going to fly as a quit. If continuing work had not been available, if they hadn't quit, so meaning like if they didn't quit, you were going to fire them anyway, that is a discharge. It'll be adjudicated as a discharge, and you as the employer will have the burden of proof in that scenario. Next slide. So what kind of documentation do you need for a voluntary quit? It's a lot less. Really and truly, in order to be compliant, all you need to provide, are the reason that the employee quit and, their dates of employment. But I would recommend, if you can, get something in writing, a written letter of resignation, a text message, an email, anything where the employee stated in writing why they are resigning. It's pretty common for the reason they give you to not quite match the reason on the unemployment claim. And so anytime you can get it in writing, that's going to be a best practice, because it's always going to be your word against the claimant's word. And so documentation is going to be key there. If you can do exit interviews, great. That's even better. If someone gave you notice, did they work out their notice? Did you let them finish their notice? If you didn't let them finish their notice, why? So that information can all come into play in certain scenarios. And then job dissatisfaction or potential resolutions associated with that. So if you do have a situation that's a little bit more complex, maybe a hostile work environment, harassment, you are going to need to have more documentation about what you did to try to resolve that, to investigate, to make the employee more comfortable. So there are scenarios where you might need a bit more documentation with a voluntary quit, but in general, your standard voluntary resignations, really best practice is just dates of employment, the reason the employee provided, and if you can provide something in writing like a resignation letter, that's really what the state is going to be looking for in that scenario. Next. All right. Lack of work. So obviously lack of work is the entire intent of unemployment. It's not disqualifying. If you eliminate someone's job or have a reduction in force, they're going to get unemployment, and no one, it's not in your best interest to try to fight that, right? But there are scenarios that fall into this sort of lack of work category, kind of like that part-time work we just talked about a little bit earlier. And while you can't necessarily always protest the reason for the separation, there are strategies for managing these types of claims. So that's what I want to talk about. So let's first talk about part-time work. Next slide. Okay, so with part-time work, the state categorizes it in 3 different ways. So you've got your regular part-time employees. Those are going to be the people that work the same schedule every week. So you hired somebody to be, a back end, a bookkeeper, and maybe they only work Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 9 to noon. They work that schedule every week. That is the definition of a regular part-time employee. But then you've got those part-time employees that are working all available hours. So the state would define this as anybody who works less than full-time, and their hours are going to vary week to week based on business needs. Okay. And if the person's not restricting their hours and they're accepting all available work that you're giving them, and this is primarily probably what at the YMCA, what you're going to run into is most of your part-time employees are going to fall into this sort of working all available hours category. And then you've got that third category, which is somebody who maybe is on call or a casual employee, maybe an assignment-based employee, probably doesn't apply much at the YMCA. It would be more like maybe in-home care workers, substitute teachers, that sort of thing. But those are those individuals that work less than full-time on a regular basis, but they don't have a set schedule. And they work assignments and then they're off between assignments when there's no work available, and they kind of move in and out of that being employed category. So here's what I'll say. Regular part-time is usually protestable, whereas these other 2 categories are not, but you can question availability. So first, let's talk about how to protest regular part-time. Next slide. So if you have a regular part-time employee, and again, that means they work a set schedule every week. You guys have agreed upon this at the time of hire. It rarely changes. It's pretty much always the same. You would want to just provide that in the unemployment claim. You would want to say they work a set schedule. They work the same schedule every week. If the employee has given you restrictions, maybe the reason they work that schedule is because they said, I take a class in the afternoon at the local college, and so I'm not available in the afternoon. You would want to make sure that you have a note of any availability restrictions. If their schedule's recently changed, why has it changed? And if you have part-time employees that request changes in their schedule or availability, get those in writing. It's super, super important. So regular part-time is really the only part-time that we would call protestable. So let's talk about the strategies for the ones that are working all available hours or maybe seasonal. So those types of claims, technically the separation reason is going to be considered a lack of work, which is usually going to be qualifying. But earlier I mentioned that you have to be available for work and you have to be actively seeking work. And so one of the things that you can do with these types of claims is you can question someone's availability. So if you've got a part-time employee that is not accepting all available work, and like in the situation earlier, maybe they have a full-time employer. This happened a lot during the pandemic. They lost their full-time employment and they filed a claim. Now, if you remember my charging example earlier, they're not choosing to file against the YMCA in that situation. The employee does not get to choose which employer pays the claim, okay? The state chooses that. But this individual has lost a full-time job or maybe their primary source of income. So understandably, they have filed an unemployment claim, and now the YMCA is in that claim because they work for you part-time, okay? The only way, like I said, that you can really avoid that maybe paying a partial benefit is by increasing their hours, offering them more work. If they work more, they'll be above that threshold that gets them a partial benefit. And if they refuse the work, you can then report that and question their availability, and that will cause the state to question their availability. And if they're not available for work, the state will not pay them unemployment. So availability issues is one way to, or one strategy for managing these types of claims. It is a lot to keep up with, and I do understand that, but it is one way to kind of nip in the bud those individuals that might be sort of taking advantage of the system, right? Refusing work and then collecting benefits. So you want to make sure that you do report those availability concerns and work refusals. Next one. Okay, so here's another one for lack of work claims. So I mentioned earlier that temporary or seasonal work is considered a lack of work. It is, even though you hired somebody and it was agreed upon at the time of hire that it was going to be a temporary assignment. When that assignment is over, as long as they're still actively seeking work and they're available for work, it's a lack of work. The state is not going to penalize people for taking temporary assignments, right? Because if they did, then people would never would accept nothing but permanent full-time work. And so if they're meeting all the requirements, they're eligible. But there are some specific provisions. So summer camp employees in a lot of states, and the ones that I'm aware of are listed on this slide. In a lot of states, camp staff are actually exempt from unemployment coverage. But the key is to know that and to not report them as covered wages on your unemployment wage filings. So where we often see mistakes with non-covered employment, so like summer camp employees in these particular states, or like AmeriCorps employees, things like that, is the employer doesn't realize to omit them from those quarterly wage filings that you have to report to the state every quarter. And the state sees that there's covered wages and this person has now separated and it's a lack of work, they're going to be eligible. But if they fit this criteria, you can actually exclude them. So if you operate your camp less than 7 months a year, if you employ this person less than 13 weeks a year, and if they're a full-time student, in these states, you actually can omit them from covered wages. Don't report them on your unemployment filings, and they will actually not be eligible for unemployment. And I would actually argue that even if you're not in one of these states, hiring full-time students in the summer is also a great strategy in general, because I mentioned earlier, you have to be available for work. You can't be in school full-time and collecting unemployment. So if you hire a full-time student that's home for the summer and they're going to go back to school in the fall, they're not going to be eligible for unemployment. So even if you're not in one of these states, I still highly recommend, if you can hire full-time students, I would do so, because they're typically not going to be able to collect unemployment. Now, if you have summer camp employees that aren't full-time students and, the summer's over and their job is over and they filed a claim and they're eligible for unemployment, and maybe another job comes up at the Y, maybe consider reaching out to that employee first. If they fit the skills and the requirements, maybe offer them that job if they're currently collecting unemployment from you. Because in that same scenario, either you get them like as part-time, either you get them back to work and they stop collecting, or B, they refuse that work, and you can report that and potentially get a disqualification. All right, next slide. I know I'm like at the end of time, but I'm on the last slide. All right, so another thing for lack of work claims is just make sure that you know the severance rules in your states. If you have an employee that qualifies for a severance type separation, severance is viewed and applied differently in every single state. Some states won't even consider severance and you can still collect full unemployment. Other states, it depends on how it's paid, whether it's lump sum or allocated. And then last but not least, same with those summer camp employees. Know if your state considers severance to be covered wages, because what you don't want is in a state where it's not considered covered wages, you report that severance payment, and maybe a year from now, the person opens a new claim and suddenly they're requalifying on their severance payments. So definitely know the rules before you give severance. Just check, AI or ChatGPT. They should be able to help you with the severance rules in your state. All right, Heidi. I was at the end, but
you covered a lot there.
Yeah.
And I just want to, there is one quick question that hopefully we can get to. I know some of you might have to leave. We've hit our hour, but Stuart had a question about timeliness. He said, what have you seen as timeliness between warnings to show a pattern? Example, if we give a verbal in 2025, then a written in early 26, then let the person go today for an infraction, is that going to hold up as a pattern?
Yeah. Well, I think if it has to follow your policy. So whatever your so the part of the reason you have to provide a copy of your policies when you protest a discharge is because the state wants to know that you're enforcing it per your policy, that you're following your policies. So whatever your policy says in regards to the timing of warnings and what qualifies, like what that progressive discipline looks like and the timing on that. Then as long as you're within that policy window, I would say you'd be fine. But if it's a situation where maybe they've had a lot of warnings over the years and the one that corresponds to the final incident is from several years ago, I say absolutely still, even though it may not have been part of the reason why they were terminated, maybe it's an older warning, but that would at least show the pattern of they've done this before and they know and they've been warned about it. So that's really all you're trying to show, is that this person understands that this could be something that could potentially lead to a discharge.
Okay, thank you. And I do not see any other questions. I do want to thank you again, Nicole and Greg, and Best Supporting Actor Evan, for helping me get back online. Thank you, everyone. Again, I believe the recording of this will come to you directly from Zoom, and you will also get follow-up email from Janessa. So if you think of questions that were not that come up, maybe pop in your mind later, we can certainly address those. And if you are interested in looking at our services, here's my contact information. Again, Janessa will be reaching out to you as well. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you all have a great day. Maybe I'll see you at General Assembly in a few weeks in New Orleans. Thank you.